For years, India and the United States have been very close strategic partners. And I think the question that emerges is, where is this partnership going next? What are the expectations of the United States, of India, and vice versa? We've had very close military-to-military relations. But what happens next? Joining us now, a very special guest. Chairman William Thornberry is the chairman of the U.S. Armed Services Committee. He's here in India. He's been meeting a lot of our top leaders. He is a very important person in the United States in that he oversees the Pentagon, all U.S. military services, and the Department of Defense's agencies as well. Thank you very much, sir, for speaking to us. One of the rules, or which the United States had established earlier on this year, was CAATSA, or Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. Now, the reason I ask you about this is that it potentially impacts India as well, because we have very close military-to-military relations with Russia. We're acquiring weaponry from them. Is there likely to be an India-specific change to that, an India-specific exception to that rule?
I don't think there will be an India-specific exception. But in the legislation that passed the House just last Thursday, there was additional flexibility in the law for nations that have historical ties and thus Russian equipment that they need to have parts for and maintenance, but are also working in partnership in various ways with the United States. So I think there will be some additional flexibility that will not just be limited to India, but there are other countries that fall into that category as well. Yeah.
India's just gone ahead and more or less announced that it's acquiring S-400 surface-to-air missile systems from Russia. In fact, the Prime Minister was in Sochi in Russia some time back, just a few days back, and I think they've closed out this deal. Is this a matter of concern for the United States? Because it's not an old deal, it's not spare parts for something we've acquired, it's a new process.
Yes, it's a matter of concern. It's a matter of concern of any nation with whom we work would acquire this technology because it threatens our ability to work interoperably in the future. And so I hope that the Indian government will take its time and consider all of the consequences for this. I think it would be helpful perhaps if some of the experts on the American side and on the Indian side can confer about the concerns that we have. And again, our concerns with this system are not just with India, but with other nations that are considering buying it as well.
But in terms of sanctions, could the acquisition of the system result in American sanctions on India?
Well, I do think there will be flexibility on sanctions, but separate from CAATSA and any sanctions, the acquisition of this technology will limit, I'm afraid, the degree with which the United States will feel comfortable bringing additional technology into whatever country we're talking about. And that's the reason it threatens the ability to work interoperably in the future. And that concern is separate from any sanctions, CAATSA-related concern.
And is that something you've brought up in your meetings in New Delhi?
It is something that we have discussed, and again, we have frankly discussed it with other nations as well who may be considering this same system.
Yeah. One of the points the United States is looking at is to explore ways, possibly with India, on matters relating to missile defense. Does the acquisition of the S-400 potentially impact that?
Well, just to backstep for a second, it was the United States Congress that designated India a couple years ago as a major defense partner. And in that law, it listed a number of areas, military areas with which we want to cooperate, maritime awareness, counterterrorism, and the like. So what we have in this law was to add missile defense cooperation as an additional area with which we would like to cooperate. And as we see around the world, the proliferation of missiles is a growing concern. Yeah. So I don't know that is really related to this particular system that we're talking about, but I do think that is a fruitful area of cooperation in the future between the United States and India.
Realistically, do you anticipate a future where India's missile shield or missile defenses could be provided through American technology?
A combination of perhaps of American and Indian technology.
Right.
We work closely, for example, with the Israelis, with their technology, some assistance from us to defend against missile attack. Again, this threat of missiles is growing around the world, and all nations are going to need to consider how to defend yourself against missile attack, just like we have to defend ourselves against airplanes and ships and other sorts of military hardware. So because of the technology sectors in both nations, we can benefit each other, I think, with this sort of cooperation.
Yeah. Recently, legislation in the United States has changed to allow countries like India to acquire armed U.S. drones. Is that something you see as a big step forward and potentially between India and the United States? Should India actually decide to acquire such a system? And could India use American-made armed drones against terrorist camps?
Well, I do think it is significant that the United States has somewhat relaxed its policy to allow close friends and partners to consider at least buying unmanned aerial vehicles. Yes. And this is one of the areas where the acquisition of the Russian anti-aircraft system will make the acquisition of that technology somewhat more difficult. But there would be agreements, I'm sure, about those systems, what their characteristics would be. Would they be armed? Would they not be armed? I think what the United States has done so far is largely unarmed systems. But of course, we all face a common threat of terrorists, and so we would want to work together in new ways. We work together now. We'd want to work together in even new, more productive ways.
Chairman, what you're telling me is really interesting, and as I see it as somebody who's followed this process, possibly a step back in that you're saying that, acquisition of systems like American drones, armed drones, could perhaps run into problems with India going ahead with this S-400 deal. Is the U.S. really that concerned enough for this fantastic strategic relationship between our countries to actually take a step back? Because technology is very much a cornerstone of that.
Actually, I see it differently. I think there is very healthy cooperation between the U.S. and India in a whole host of military areas. But there's the opportunity to take it to the next level, to do much more. And my mentioning of this concern is that I don't want there to be any obstacles, because we share so much. We share common interests around the world. We share common concerns around the world. We share common desires about how the world can be a better place. And it is through that sort of military cooperation, not just military, we cooperate in many ways, but I focus primarily in military areas. It is through that sort of military cooperation that we can both grow closer to achieving our objectives. And I don't want there to be anything that prevents us from working even more closely together in the future, whether it be at sea against terrorists or missiles or whatever. Then I don't want any obstacles to come in the way.
Yeah. India has a close relationship with Iran. Our energy security is dependent on Iranian oil reserves. We've invested billions towards the construction of, or part construction of a port over there, which fulfills strategic requirements. It enables us to get, for example, supplies into Afghanistan. The US has withdrawn from Iran in terms of the nuclear agreement which was reached. Is there therefore a potential of serious differences going forward between New Delhi and Washington on New Delhi's Iran policy?
Well, I think it should be a matter of conversation between the two governments. Afghanistan, you mentioned, is another area where we have so many common interests and are working together for common objectives. So, for example, this port that would help facilitate getting supplies into Afghanistan is something on which I think we can have fruitful discussions. Yeah. At the same time, of course, the United States is concerned, as I'm sure India is as well, about the potential for a nuclear-armed Iran and what that would mean to heighten tensions with other countries then feeling like they had to acquire nuclear weapons. So there's a strong feeling in the United States that we need to take measures to prevent that from occurring, but that should not prevent us from working together in the other areas.
Yeah. China has a growing presence, across the Indian Ocean, certainly in the Pacific as well. They've got a growing fleet. Where do you see the Chinese Navy expand? Do you see them having a significant say in the future in the Indian Ocean region, which is an area of concern, obviously, for India and also for the United States?
Oh, I think there's no question. China is expanding at a rate that most people would not have believed just a few years ago. If you see their acquisition of ports, they will say at the beginning it is just a commercial port. We have no intentions to militarize it, and then one day we wake up and we find military capability. Whether we're talking the port in Djibouti, we're talking about all the islands in the South China Sea, and so we see this disturbing trend that I think is of equal concern in the United States and in India, and that makes our partnership to ensure that there is free and open use of the seas to benefit all nations, that makes our partnership toward that goal even more important.
Freedom of navigation is a really important bedrock of our strategic partnership. In the future, would you like to see India having a bigger say in the South China Seas, specifically through joint patrolling with the U.S. Navy?
I think it is a healthy thing for India to take on more responsibility throughout the Indo-Pacific region. As a matter of fact, one of the provisions in the bill that we just passed last week in the House renames our Pacific Command based in Hawaii the Indo-Pacific Command, because these areas are not isolated from one another. It is one continuous region where a greater role of India and in partnership with other nations, including all the ASEAN nations, is going to be important.
Yeah. And one final question about the Quad. Again, how do you see that developing? How important do you believe that relationship would be for the U.S., America, for the U.S., India, and our partners?
Well, I think it is important. There are a number of organizations or groupings of nations that get together to discuss matters of common interest, and certainly this is one of them. But it does not seek to exclude any others or make decisions for any others. One of the many values the United States and India share is this inclusiveness. We want all nations to participate in decision-making for our mutual future. And so when it comes to issues in the Indo-Pacific region, we want to work with other partners in addition to those nations who are part of these Quad meetings.
All right, sir. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Really appreciate that. Chairman Thornberry, they're giving us an idea of where he sees the India-US strategic partnership going, areas of concerns which have emerged lately, but also the promise of a good future in both countries working together.